Russia did not lose this position to a Ukrainian offensive. It did not lose it to superior firepower, a flanking maneuver, or an overwhelming assault. It lost it because its own soldiers drank themselves to death. Their bodies were covered with sleeping bags and left arranged at their posts, so the position would look manned, and their own commanders did not notice for 6 days. Ukraine noticed first, and when it did, it walked straight through the open door. But the sleeping bags are not the most disturbing part of this story. The most disturbing part is what 6 days of silence from a forward post, silence that triggered absolutely no response from the army behind it, reveals about the state of the force holding this entire line. In the Kamyanske sector of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Russian forces maintained a network of forward observation posts in a dacha area, a cluster of small countryside cottages sitting close to the contact line. A post like this is the Army's first set of eyes. It watches for enemy movement, identifies targets for artillery, and maintains constant radio contact with the command sitting behind it. It is the thing that tells the Army what is happening in front of it. Without it, the section of line it covers is functionally blind. At some point in mid-May 2026, the soldiers at one of these posts stopped doing all of those things. The radio went quiet, the position stopped reporting, and the reason had nothing to do with Ukraine. Ukraine's military intelligence, HUR, published an intercepted radio conversation on May 20th, 2026. 2 Russian soldiers were discussing what had been found at that post. One of them described it plainly. He said, "There were a lot of 200 there. Russian military slang for killed in action." He said they had been poisoned by blue, which is what Russian soldiers call toxic surrogate alcohol on the front. And then he confirmed the detail that makes this story something far larger than a discipline failure. He said 8 to 10 bodies were lying at the position, covered with sleeping bags, left exactly where they had fallen, and they had been there for 5 to 6 days. The bodies had not been evacuated. They had not been removed and replaced with living soldiers. They had simply been left in place, covered, arranged at their posts, in a position that from any external view would appear to be manned and operational. The line looked held. The only things missing were breathing men and a working radio. What makes the intercept truly chilling is not what was said, but how it was said. The soldier describing 10 dead comrades under sleeping bags at a forward position was not horrified. He was not angry. There was no urgency in his voice, no sense that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He described it the way someone describes finding a broken piece of equipment, flat, routine, as if this was simply the kind of thing that happens now and is noted and moved past. He said, "And ours and the Allies were neatly laid out, covered with sleeping bags." That tone, that complete absence of shock, matters more than the body count. Because a soldier who is disturbed by finding 10 dead comrades abandoned at a post belongs to an army that still has standards. A soldier who sounds bored by it belongs to an army that has already accepted this as normal. The Russian unit in this sector had reached the second condition long before anyone picked up that radio. Now consider what happened during those 5 to 6 days while the bodies were lying there. The post had stopped transmitting entirely. No position reports, no target coordinates, no radio contact of any kind. And in the entire time between when those soldiers died and when Ukraine's intelligence identified the unmonitored gap, not one Russian officer, not one unit commander, not one soldier from the positions behind that post went to check why it had gone silent. The position continued to appear on Russian command maps as a functioning defensive node. In reality, it was a cottage holding corpses under sleeping bags, and the gap in surveillance it created, the blind spot where nobody was watching and nobody was reporting, was sitting open and unguarded in the middle of the Russian defensive line. The gap in Russian surveillance created by that dead post was spotted by Ukrainian reconnaissance before the Russian command even registered that something was wrong. Ukraine's drone operators and signals intelligence identified the unmonitored sector, confirmed no active defense was present, and began moving. The door was not forced open. It was simply found unlocked and walked through. But to understand what Ukraine did with that open door, and more importantly, what that 6-day silence reveals about the army standing behind it, you need to look at something far larger than one drunk unit in one cottage area. Because this was not an accident, bad luck, or a rogue unit slipping through the cracks. The evidence existed months before the post went silent. An army rotting from the inside long before anyone arranged those sleeping bags. This was not the first warning. Months before those bodies were found under sleeping bags in the Kamyanske cottage area, Ukrainian monitoring organizations had already been tracking and naming specific Russian units in this exact sector for exactly this kind of collapse. The evidence was documented, it was published, and the Russian command did nothing about it. In November 2025, a Ukrainian monitoring organization called Atesh filed a report on the 108th Air Assault Regiment operating in the Zaporizhzhia direction. The language in that report was not vague. Atesh described the unit as having reached a critical state of normalized alcoholism. Soldiers were falling asleep on guard duty, forgetting their weapons, opening fire on their own positions. The unit was described as incapable of fulfilling combat duties. 1 month later, in December 2025, Atesh filed another report on a different unit in the same direction. The 74th Motorized Rifle Regiment had earned a name among its own soldiers, the Alko Battalion. Officers were issuing combat orders while drunk. Assault groups were being sent to attack positions already held by their own side, and the unit was losing up to 100 soldiers per month, not primarily to Ukrainian firepower, but to the consequences of its own command being too intoxicated to function. These were not outliers. Across the broader Russian military in 2025, over 600 soldiers died off the battlefield entirely from suicide, drug use, and circumstances unrelated to combat. The front was consuming men before Ukraine even had to touch them. But the detail that connects all of this to the Kamyanske post, the detail that transforms a pattern of alcoholism into a story about a command that had lost control of its own picture, came 4 days before HUR published that intercept. On May 16, 2026, the Institute for the Study of War published its assessment of the exact same sector. Russian military bloggers with direct access to frontline information were describing the situation northwest and west of Orikhiv as tense and difficult. That was concerning enough. But buried inside that assessment was a single observation that explains everything about the 6 days of silence. The gap between what Russian commanders claimed to hold and what they actually held had become so wide that commanders in the field could not form a clear assessment of where their own front line was. Hear that again. Russian commanders did not know where their own line was, not because Ukraine had moved it overnight, because the reporting coming up from the front had become so unreliable, so disconnected from reality, that the map in the command post no longer matched the ground it was supposed to represent. The post in the Kamyanske cottage area was not the only position Russia had lost track of. It was simply the one where the consequences became impossible to ignore. The 6 days of silence did not fall through a crack in the system. The cracks were in the system. Ukraine had been watching all of this, not just the gap left by the dead post, but the entire pattern of deterioration across the sector. And when the moment came to act, what it built was not a massive assault. It was a precise, fast, layered operation that began not with soldiers crossing a line, but with a single drone strike on a building 36 kilometers away from Stepnohirsk. In the town of Prishab, Russian drone operators had established a position that functioned as the surveillance hub for the sector. This was the building where operators monitored Ukrainian movement, guided Russian artillery onto targets, and stored the equipment that kept Russian eyes active over the front. As long as it was standing, any Ukrainian movement toward the gap in the line would be detected, reported, and struck before it could develop into anything serious. Ukrainian kamikaze drones destroyed it. One strike. The sector's drone coverage collapsed. An already blind and unmonitored gap became completely dark at the exact moment Ukraine needed it to be. With Russia's eyes gone, Ukraine moved through the rest of the sequence with speed and precision. Artillery struck Russian personnel in the Mali-Shcherbaki area, hitting the approach corridor and suppressing any organized response. Near Stepov, FPV drones and drone-dropped grenades hit Russian shelters and personnel simultaneously. And in a detail that shows exactly how thoroughly Ukraine had mapped this sector's vulnerabilities, Ukrainian operators specifically targeted Russian radio antennas near Stepov, cutting the communication lines between the frontline soldiers and the commanders behind them. In the space of a coordinated strike sequence, Russian forces near the gap were blind, being hit from multiple directions and unable to call for reinforcement or report what was happening to anyone above them. Then came the assault. The 153rd Mechanized Brigade reinforced the Axis. HUR's special unit Arton and the International Legion moved into Stepnohirsk. Both carry the kind of urban combat experience that only comes from 2 years of clearing Russian fortified positions at close range, building by building, room by room. Inside the town, they went house to house. Each building was checked for booby traps, for holdout defenders, for anything left behind. Geolocated footage released by HUR showed Ukrainian armored vehicles moving through an intersection in the town center that military analysts had assessed just days earlier as firmly Russian-held ground. Artan's commander, Viktor Torkotyuk, described the clearing operation in a single sentence. Each house was checked for surprises and remnants of the occupants. East of Kamyanske, Ukrainian special forces approached a Russian defensive position under drone reconnaissance cover, identified the defenders inside, and assaulted the dugouts. The soldiers holding that position were Russian paratroopers, the units Russia deploys specifically because they are supposed to hold when everything else breaks. 6 of them surrendered. Russia had sent its best. They put their hands up. 1 dead observation post, 1 blind sector, 1 precisely executed kill chain, and a town that Russia had spent more than a year trying to take had changed hands. But what broke at Stepnohirsk did not stay at Stepnohirsk. The consequences of that breach were already spreading across the Russian defensive architecture in the south, threatening something far more significant than a single town on a Zaporizhzhia map. Stepnohirsk is not valuable because of what is inside it. What makes it matter is where it sits and what it can reach from its elevated position. The heights above Stepnohirsk overlook the logistics routes feeding Russia's entire southern axis in this sector. They allow artillery to range the southern outskirts of Zaporizhzhia city, roughly 20 kilometers to the north, and they sit at exactly the point where a Ukrainian force pushing further can begin threatening the supply line running through Kamyanske, the artery keeping Russian units in this pocket fed, armed, and rotating. Russia understood this. That is why it spent more than a year trying to take this ground. Kirill Budanov, head of Ukrainian military intelligence, described what Russia had committed to this single objective. He said, Russia had been trying to take Stepnohirsk for more than a year, throwing significant resources at it and suffering enormous losses in the process. A year of assaults. A year of sending men forward toward a position it never managed to hold. And then Ukraine took it by walking through a gap Russia had opened with its own dysfunction. The immediate consequence of losing Stepnohirsk was not just the town itself. It was what the loss exposed around it. With Ukrainian forces holding key positions inside Stepnohirsk and pushing simultaneously toward Kamyanske from the east and toward Stepo from the west, the Russian units in this pocket were facing pressure from multiple directions at once. The Kamyanske supply route was now under direct threat of being severed. Russia's response confirmed exactly how seriously it read the danger. It redeployed airborne assault units to the sector specifically to stop the Ukrainian advance. These are not ordinary infantry. These are the soldiers Russia sends when it needs something held under maximum pressure. Russia sent them. They were still pushed back. And then east of Kamyanske, during a clearing operation against a Russian defensive position, 6 of those paratroopers surrendered. Elite soldiers, the men Russia had sent precisely because it needed this line to hold. They did not fight to the last position. They assessed what was in front of them and walked out with their hands up. 6 surrenders from an elite unit is not a statistic. It is a signal. It tells you something about what the soldiers on that line understood about their situation that the commanders behind them were still trying to deny. The wider picture across the Zaporizhzhia axis was already moving before Stepnohirsk fell. Since January 2026, Ukraine has pushed Russian forces back up to 14 kilometers south of Zaporizhzhia city. The town of Primorsky had been liberated. Kirill Budanov drew his conclusion from the result without hedging. He said the Russians have no chance of threatening Zaporizhzhia. The army that spent a year bleeding toward this ground 1 meter at a time just lost the position it was attacking from, through a gap left by soldiers it had forgotten to check on. Now, the honest accounting. Because overstating what Ukraine achieved here would be as misleading as ignoring it. Ukraine has not broken the Russian front in Zaporizhzhia. Russia still holds substantial territory across this sector and has demonstrated throughout this war that it can absorb losses that would collapse most other armies and keep holding lines that should have given way long ago. The 6 surrendered paratroopers are a meaningful signal, but not a confirmed collapse of morale across the entire force. Russia is still running its artillery campaign across this sector. Zaporizhzhia city is still being shelled. The front has shifted, but it has not broken open. The connection between the dead observation post and the Stepnohirsk breakthrough, while reported as linked by multiple sources and logical in sequence, has not been independently confirmed as direct mechanical cause and effect. HUR reported the two events separately. The research document itself flags this gap. The script acknowledges it. Russia is also not standing still. It redeployed its best available soldiers to this sector the moment it understood the threat. It will keep trying to stabilize this line, and the army that has been documented as dysfunctional in multiple units across this direction is still, for now, present and fighting. But here is the verdict that survives every one of those honest limits. A defensive line is only as strong as its weakest monitored point. Not its weakest defended point, its weakest monitored point. Because a position that is undefended but appears held on the command map is more dangerous to the army behind it than a position that is openly abandoned. An openly abandoned position gets replaced. A position that appears held fools the commanders behind it into trusting a line that no longer exists. Russia's command in this sector had already lost the ability to tell the difference between those two conditions before Ukraine found the open door. ISW confirmed it on May 16th, 4 days before the intercept was published. Russian commanders could not reconcile what they claimed to hold with what they actually held. The gap between the map and reality had widened to the point that commanders on the ground could not form a clear picture of their own front line. And when a forward post went silent for 6 days, it produced no response. Not because commanders were negligent on that specific day, because silence had already become the baseline expectation across this sector. The system had stopped treating silence as an alarm. It had recalibrated itself around failure without anyone deciding to do that. It simply happened, unit by unit, report by report, bottle by bottle, across months that the ATESH monitoring organization had been documenting by name, while the Russian command apparently was not reading the same reports. That is the permanent shift this story represents, not the loss of one town, not the recapture of one elevated position. The permanent shift is that Russia is now managing a line it cannot fully see, in a sector where its own dysfunction was documented months in advance, against an opponent whose surveillance was precise enough to identify an unmonitored gap within days of it opening and move through it within a week. The Institute for the Study of War, ATESH, HUR, and Russian millbloggers themselves all pointed to the same reality from different directions before this breach occurred. A Kremlin-connected blogger complained that commanders could not form a clear assessment of the situation. ATESH named 2 separate units in the same sector as normalized alcohol disasters months before the Kamyanske post went silent. And HUR published the voice of a Russian soldier describing 10 dead comrades under sleeping bags. None of those signals was acted on by the Russian command. All of them were watched by Ukraine. Russia tried to take Stepnohirsk for more than a year at enormous cost. It failed every single time. Ukraine took it from the direction of a post Russia had forgotten to check, led by a small assault force that moved faster than a larger defending army could respond, after a kill chain that began with one drone strike on a building 36 kilometers away. And the soldiers who were supposed to be watching the door that Ukraine walked through were under sleeping bags in a cottage. They had been there for nearly a week. Their own army never came to look. For 6 days, the Russian defensive line near Kamyanske was held by nothing except corpses arranged to look like sleeping men. The radio was silent. The position looked manned. And the only side that eventually noticed the post was dead was the one that walked through it. That is not a story about soldiers making catastrophic decisions under pressure. Every army in every war has had those moments. This is a story about the system that was supposed to catch the failure and could not. About a command so hollowed out that a forward position could stop breathing for nearly a week and produce no alarm. About an army that stopped checking whether its own people were alive and discovered too late that its enemy had never stopped watching. So here is the question we want to leave you with. Russian command has already lost track of where its own front line actually is in this sector. Ukraine is finding and walking through every gap it cannot see. How long before the next sleeping bag position opens on this axis? And when it does, Will Russia have anything capable left to send to fill it? Tell us what you think in the comments below. This is the Frontline Show. We will be back the moment the next development matters. Thank you for watching.